Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kalb. I'm director of the Joan Shorenstein Barone Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of tonight's discussion, which is Lessons Learned from Armenia, an Agenda for the Future. Last week at Texas A&M, President Bush spoke about U.S.-Soviet relations, and toward the end of his speech, the President said, "It's a sad truth that nothing forces us to recognize our common humanity more swiftly than a natural disaster." I'm thinking, of course, of Soviet Armenia, just a few months ago, a tragedy without blame, warlike devastation without war. What the President was referring to, we know, was an earthquake on December 7th of last year, an unexceptional Wednesday morning until the earth shook and the Richter scale measured 6.9. It was all over in a matter of seconds. Mikhail Gorbachev was on a visit to the United Nations, ready to go on to Cuba when he got the news. He canceled his plans and promptly returned to Moscow. The following day, he flew to Armenia personally to inspect the damage. It was enormous. Spitak and Leninagan, two towns, suffered the most. Initial reports said 100,000 people might have been killed. Later, these reports were scaled down. It's now estimated that 25,000 people were killed. Some 500,000 survivors left without homes or possessions. The U.S. government, through its Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, helped, as did many other governments around the world. For the first time since World War II, the Soviet government allowed foreign aircraft to proceed directly to the airport in Yerevan. $50 million in global foreign assistance reached Armenia within a matter of days. Now the sad remaining cleanup is left for the people of Armenia and for the government of the Soviet Union primarily. Coincidentally, perhaps, I noticed yesterday and again today reports on a new book by Harrison Salisbury called The Great Black Dragon Fire, which focuses on the staggering destruction and ecological damage caused by fires that swept through the Hingan forests of Manchuria and southern Siberia in May of 1987. These fires were more than 10 times the size of last year's fires at the Yellowstone National Park. These fires in China and Russia were one of the worst environmental disasters of this or any other century. China lost more than 3 million acres of timber. Soviet Siberia lost between 9 and 15 million acres of timber. These natural disasters happen. I've mentioned two in China and the Soviet Union. They can happen here, indeed anywhere. There is what is called the new Madrid Fault, which geologists say lies 30 miles northwest of Memphis. And if an earthquake were to strike there, it could affect 7 states: Arkansas, Alabama, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee. On April 3rd of this year in Memphis, new headquarters were dedicated for the Central United States Earthquake Consortium, CUSEC it's called. It was started in 1984 with help from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. This is one illustration of something that we can do in advance of a natural disaster. There are many other things too. Tonight we'll have an opportunity to discuss what happened in Soviet Armenia, what lessons have we learned, what should we all be doing to prepare for the next time, for there surely will be a next time. Therefore, we're talking about an agenda for the future. We've assembled a panel of experts. Dr. Claude Cadeau of the Trauma Victims Division of the International Search and Rescue Team, a medical doctor, a scholar, and a consultant to the U.S. government on foreign disasters. Dr. John Hammack is the executive director of Oxfam America, a private, nonprofit international agency that helps fund development activities in poor countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He's had firsthand experience in the droughts in Ethiopia and Mozambique and has been working on helping the victims of natural disasters in the Third World. Carolyn Hebard has been a very active dog trainer and search and rescue expert for nearly 20 years. She has participated in rescue operations in Soviet Armenia, Mexico City, and El Salvador. She is also the team leader of the U.S. Disaster Team K-9 Unit. and William Garvelink, Assistant Director of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance for Africa and Europe in the Department of State. Each of our panelists will speak for 10 minutes, and then they'll have an opportunity to question one another, and then we will open the proceedings to you. There are 2 microphones that I see right here, and when we get to that point, I will indicate that in advance, and you just have to approach the microphone and ask your question. I would appreciate it when you do that, that you really ask a question with the intention of trying to get an answer, meaning a short question, and there'll be a short answer so that we can get more of you and more of them into the proceedings. I'd like to ask Bill Garvelink to speak first. Bill?
I guess I would like to begin by focusing on the Armenia situation as I know it best, and that was in the first few days since the earthquake, dealing with the relations in Washington with the State Department, with the Soviet Embassy, and with our own arrangements in getting our rescue team out there. I did accompany the team, but I'm not a technician. There are other people here who know the details of what went on in Leninakan much better than I do. I would like to focus very briefly on the politics of how we got there. And this is instructive for preparedness activities in the future, particularly with regard to major disasters in large countries, countries that we have sensitive political relationships with, as opposed to some of the other developing countries which my office deals with much more. As you know, the earthquake excuse me, took place on December 7 at 11:41 in the morning. We had very little information on the earthquake that day. Real sketchy reports began coming in, but we didn't have any hard information. On the next day, on Thursday, we kept getting consistent reports in the office about the destruction related to the earthquake, and the trend was sort of ominous. Each report was worse than the previous one. It was the opinion of experts, however, that the Soviet Union would not permit or not request U.S. government assistance, and that we would not be playing a significant role in this earthquake. By the next day and the night, which was the day when most of the activities took place in terms of our involvement, getting involved in the earthquake, very early that morning it was clear to everyone that it was a major earthquake of catastrophic proportions. The day started with calls from the White House about making an offer of assistance to Gorbachev before he left New York. So we put together some information on what we could provide, and President Reagan called Gorbachev, expressed his condolences for what's happened, and offered assistance. The response was, "Thank you very much. I'm returning home now, and I will let you know after I survey the situation." At the same time, OFDA started its disaster planning. We called together our experts. We started to assemble the search and rescue teams, the medical doctors who would be accompanying us. We started moving supplies from Maryland to Dulles Airport, where we would be leaving. We activated the people in our stockpile at Pisa, Italy, the NATO base where we keep supplies for disasters in Africa and Europe. And we started this process, and we did it very quietly because we did not want to make this public until we had a decision from the Soviet Union. Our Soviet experts continued to tell us that we probably would not play a significant role in the earthquake, and that we would not be invited in, they thought, to participate. Then in the course of, we also at that point, which was very interesting, early on in an earthquake situation, several representatives of the Armenian community called us up, and we held several meetings, which is very unusual. When an earthquake happens, some of the groups in the United States take action very quickly, which is sometimes counterproductive in the movement of supplies in a disaster situation. We were all quite surprised when the Armenian leaders came in and said, how can we help? What's the best way to do this? How can we work together? I think it was one of the better operations we've ever had with help from the private sector. It was a very supportive relationship and I think worked very well. I think it's unique in the disaster situations, at least that I'm familiar with. Then we got into, this was about midday when all this was going on, we got into a very peculiar situation in terms of being invited to participate in a disaster response in the Soviet Union. It was our understanding that the Soviet Union was not going to ask for assistance, but would accept assistance if offered. It was the view of our government that if requested, we would provide this assistance. So we were at some sort of an impasse. The concern was Gorbachev had said he'd look into the situation, and we didn't want to appear to be pushing him too hard to allow us to provide assistance. Then we began hearing that the Swiss and the French had received permission to go into to Armenia to provide some help. We contacted the Soviet embassy in Washington, but most of their decision makers were in New York, where Gorbachev had been. So we couldn't get an answer there, or at least a clear one. Then we contacted Moscow, and they went through the foreign ministry, and we didn't get a clear answer there either. So we knew other disaster teams were moving, but we were sort of stymied at this point. So we requested a meeting with the Soviet officials, the Soviet embassy, and at 4:30 on Friday afternoon. And we had the meeting. We explained to them what we offered, what we could provide, and how we would go about that. We also pointed out that time was running short because it would take us a couple of days to arrive in Armenia. If we didn't leave very soon, the time would be too late. The response was, thank you very much, we'll be back in touch with you again. We, at that point, were having some problems with the press because they were, some of our people were together in New York City already. Supplies were moving in a lot of different directions, and it was fairly obvious that we were preparing to take off. We were trying to keep it very low key, but we didn't want to get out ahead of the decision by the Soviet Union. Then the embassy, the Soviet embassy, scheduled a meeting at 5:30 in the afternoon. But from the time of our meeting at 4:30 to 5:30, we had to make a number of decisions which had an impact on our response down the line. We decided, because of the touchiness of the situation, we would not use military aircraft, but charter civilian aircraft, which meant the amount of supplies we would be carrying, the possibility of carrying vehicles, was eliminated. We also decided not to take satellite communications with us because that could prove a problem in the relationship. These particular issues turned out to be real problems for us as time went on. Then at 5:30, the Soviet embassy in Washington announced that they would accept our assistance and that our plane could depart. So our plane picked up our people in New York, went down to Dulles, picked up the rest of us, and we took off. Now those are some of the discussions that went on at the time. Another factor, important factor for us in the way we responded in Armenia is the fact that for OFDA or AID, the earthquake occurring in Armenia could not have been in a worse location. If it had happened in Somalia, it would have been easier for us. We have embassies, aid missions, we have vehicles, we have communications equipment, we have people on the ground to do preliminary assessments. We could have done, damage assessments, injury assessments, all of these sorts of things, maps. All of that would have been waiting for us. It would have been constant communication with our aid mission and embassy. We didn't have any of that. There was no presence in Armenia of our diplomats from Moscow. We had no idea what to expect. We were frankly quite surprised because we were short of vehicles and communications and all these sorts of things. So if you put those two factors together, it proved to be a very difficult situation. I'll cut this short. What this tells us very briefly about preparedness is that in a major disaster situation like this, the host country has to take care of itself primarily. The first disaster team arrived 53 hours after the earthquake. Most of the people who were pulled from the rubble were rescued within hours and certainly within the first day. So the trick is to identify disaster-prone areas, the type of disaster that will occur there, and to facilitate preparations for those disasters, whether it's building codes, shelter construction changes, that sort of thing, civil defense, medical preparedness, and that sort of thing. It has to be done locally. The next step is for our search and rescue teams to be strengthened and our responses to speed up the responses. I think what we learned in the Armenia case is to work closely with the Armenian community, the local community in the U.S. involved. That proved extremely helpful. One of the other things that is extremely important is the need to share information. We did not know what the situation was on the ground. We had very limited information, and that caused us real problems. Our transportation was very bad. We didn't have it on the airplanes. We leased cars and buses in Yerevan and had them shipped to Leninakon, and we had more transport probably than any of the other rescue teams there, but it proved to be a real problem. Communications were very bad. We didn't take our satellites along until later, and in fact, to be overly cautious, we cut back on the handheld radios, which caused Carolyn and other problems real trouble on the ground. So the passing of information early on is very helpful. And then I think the time is right now to deal with a number of these issues, because in the 1990s, this is the International Decade. It's sponsored by the UN, the International Decade for the Reduction of Natural Disasters. And I think under this umbrella, a lot of discussions can be held with countries that are disaster prone, with the response organizations, and to develop better coordination internationally. And I think this is a real opportunity for us over the next several years to work on this. The other issue which may come up or should be addressed, and I don't quite know how to deal with this, is when the U.S. government and the Soviet Union, it's a special relationship that has certain tensions to it, I think, and certain sensitivities have to be brought to bear, and perhaps some pre-disaster agreements should be considered between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, communications, air landing rights, and these sorts of things. But I think under the umbrella of the decade, the time is right to deal with a number of these issues, which would help if another disaster of this magnitude occurs in the future.
Bill, thank you very much. Our next two speakers were actually there in Soviet Armenia. Bill was kind of describing the steps leading up to Americans arriving on the scene, and Dr. Claude Cadeau was among the first to arrive. Dr.
Good evening. My name is Claude Cadeau. I'm an emergency physician. I'm also the Chief Medical Officer for the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in Washington, D.C. In my role as consultant to OFDA, I've done quite a bit to help OFDA view the importance of incorporating medicine into the search and rescue team. But I am not a government employee, and to that extent, I welcome opportunities such as this to come and explain to people where their tax dollars went. This was not a low-cost operation. We spend a hell of a lot more putting people on the moon, but these are valuable resources, and as we're all aware, these federal dollars are shrinking daily. So really, why is this important to us? My part of this conversation will focus for the next 9 or so minutes on what actually transpired in Armenia that first week that the U.S. government planted its flag, as we quite literally and physically did on Soviet soil. And hopefully, in the discussion that follows, we'll have a chance to get into some more detail. There were approximately 40 of us that took a chartered U.S. carrier into the Soviet airspace on December 10th. The expectations were probably as varied as the number of individuals that were aboard. The team on that plane included government individuals, some Armenian representatives, including 2 physicians, the 5 emergency physicians, and 1 physician from the West Coast, Dr. Robert Gale, who was invited to participate insofar as he had prior knowledge of the Soviet medical system in his work at Chernobyl. And the dog teams, including Caroline and Ollie, who you'll see down at the end there. In fact, Ollie was situated directly behind me on the plane, and I tell you, I still can't forget that the look on that face. I don't know who was more startled when I turned around. The most critical phenomenon that one finds at a disaster, to my mind, is chaos. It is the complete usurpation of rational dealings by the second law of thermodynamics, just the tendency to entropy and chaos. We actually did not even have the opportunity to land at, I believe, sometime around 5 a.m., about 24 hours after we left, when we had to pull up very vigorously off of the runway just moments before landing. There were 2 airliners sitting in the middle of the runway. No one had realized we were sitting there. That began what became a long series of remarkable revelations on our part of just how much work we had ahead of us. But on the other hand, this is a disaster. This is the way it works, and it affords you as many opportunities as it does setbacks. To complicate matters worse, and adding to a very surreal environment, the first individuals to greet us were uniformed AK-47 slung KGB officers, and we all had to readjust our thinking. Just what have we gotten ourselves into, and just what are we going to be able to get accomplished here? The revelation continued to unfold, and found that not only was this a catastrophe of quite significant import, but that people needed our help. These cities that we would be working in were heretofore considered closed cities, that were the doors of which were thrown wide open for the United States and other international groups. The landing in Yerevan was very deceptive. Otherwise, there was really very little damage to the city, a couple of broken windows. As we headed north, we began to see more and more signs of destruction. And then, all of a sudden, from this beautiful plain surrounded with snow-covered mountains, we met Lenenikon. The hours that it took to get in were accounted for by the traffic trying to get out. Countless numbers of small Fiat-like vehicles with 1 or more coffins slung across the top. The team eventually made camp in 2 places. One, right downtown across from the KGB offices, and the remainder of the operations up at the airport. Perhaps Caroline, more than anyone, experienced the necessity for that, insofar as the understandably bereaved Armenian populace would enter the tents and personally request that the dogs come out 24 hours a day looking for survivors under the rubble. The medical team was divided in half. 2 of us stayed there because we were given to understand that there was more than adequate medical care there. Well, there wasn't, and it would have helped to have had all 5 emergency physicians there, but once you leave, there's really no way back in a situation like that. The American team, which involved search components that Caroline will allude to a little more directly, the extricators, represented by individuals from Fairfax, Virginia, and Metro-Dade, Florida, who have had considerable experience in Latin America, and 2 emergency physicians just to keep an eye on things. Further, and in fact last, is a structural engineer who had perhaps the most difficult job of determining which buildings we would be allowed to search and which ones we wouldn't, no matter how much the dogs felt that there'd be someone living trapped beneath the rubble. The team was situated in a airport, well, across from the airport of Lananacon is a huge cornfield. We erected tents and began to receive literally tons of U.S.-sponsored medical supplies. The estimate that OFDA had of not just government but non-government goods is, I think, underestimated, and it ran into the tens of millions of dollars. The perhaps most difficult part of my job was not so much to follow the team as it was to find the most appropriate disposition for some of these goods, because what some people got, someone did not get. I must say, though, that the choice of equipment that was determined valuable by the U.S. government was right on. It's quite honestly something I was not expecting as a taxpayer, but there it was. They did a wonderful job. There were any number of instances where the U.S. team did interface with the Armenian people, and in fact, there are moments that I will never forget when, while food was very scarce, for instance, one evening we came back, dog-tired, if I'll excuse the expression, to find a table loaded down with rationed goods that the Soviet Armenians had brought to offer to us as a way of saying thanks. Never mind feeling uncomfortable about it, it did require a certain adjustment, but it was the sort of thing that one just was not able to refuse, because if to refuse an Armenian is, well, it just isn't done. I think the bonds that were established then and there, not just on behalf of the U.S. team, but I think that all the international teams, and there were several, with the Armenians are eternal. I think that all of us who came away will never forget this experience, and I hope we have a little more time to discuss it more fully after Caroline has a chance to speak with you. Thank you.
Our next speakers are Caroline Hebard and Ollie, and she can divide up the 10 minutes that she's got, 8 minutes for herself and 2 minutes for Ollie, if you like.
Every time I move, it's time to run. I am, as Mr. Kalb said, the team leader for the U.S. dog team. The U.S. disaster dog team did really not start to develop till 1985 with the Mexican earthquake. That was the first time that the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance listened to the pleas of all these volunteer handlers and finally succumbed and said, okay, maybe we'll shut them up forever. We'll let them go to Mexico. It did not shut us up. It just heightened our enthusiasm for what we could do as a resource. Since then, we went to El Salvador and then Armenia. Armenia, if I were to compare it to the other two earthquakes that I was at, was probably the worst I had ever seen. There's no question about it. In the other earthquakes, at least part of the city still functioned. But in Armenia, if you take places like Svitak and even Lenanikan, the main function of the town was totally disrupted. It was gone. I'd like to explain a little bit, because I know I always get these questions, how the dogs function. They are trained on human scent. We have found over the years that with added hours of training, and I mean a lot of hours of training, you can teach these dogs to go over rubble and into disaster areas. And the bond between the handler and the dog is very important. These dogs actually indicate differently for a live or a dead victim, which is a matter of the handler really knowing that dog. Our system of working is one dog will go in, search the area for about 15 minutes and be taken off. This is very strenuous. It's very search-intensive type of work as opposed to your wilderness type of work. And then a second dog will come in to confirm what the first dog found. We're very careful on being very sure that we have a live find, because we cannot commit the rescue component to a rescue that sometimes can take up to 18 hours unless we're pretty sure. In Armenia, we did not have a lot of live finds. However, in retrospect, I realized that it was extremely important for the people in Armenia to find the bodies of their families and to be able to bury them before the bulldozers came and leveled the buildings. And so I think all of us on the team feel that we did a very valuable service. We were locating most of the time bodies. I think what Claude said about the feeling that we got about the people was very true. Great deal of warmth. A wonderful feeling of international coordination, which I had never felt at any other disaster, and which is going to continue. We will be training and working with various foreign countries, with Israel, with Austria, with Germany. The Soviet Union wants to build up a team. The way to get things globally to work is to have people within areas that have seismic activity, to have trained teams themselves, to help them be prepared and trained. We also have a lot of seismic activity in our country, and I think what we have learned from our involvement internationally will hopefully help this country to get better prepared. We need training sites. We need places where communities, states on a state level can prepare for earthquakes. We basically need rubble piles. Our team makes no bones about it. I called up a bunch of demolition companies and said, I'm here. Let me know when you're going to crash a building. We'll train any place at this point. We really need to work and train and perfect it. We need to train more dogs. We need to train more people. We're talking about a coordinated resource. The dogs don't work alone. If we find we need someone who can take them out, and the people who extricate need someone like Claude who can help stabilize the victim and hopefully save it. It's a coordinated effort. And I really feel that we've got, as Marvin Kalb mentioned, the new Madrid Fault, which was the worst earthquake they've ever had. We've got the San Francisco, Los Angeles fault running up through there. We even have one in North Carolina, and we actually have a fault line that runs up through New Jersey and New York and up into Boston. We also have other disasters to consider. Everyone is keyed on earthquake. If you think of the destruction you can get from a hurricane, a tornado, even a flood. I worked the Johnstown floods back in the 70s, and that was pretty destructive. We also have another thing we have to face. We could have terrorism. We could have another Pan Am crash. And I talked to the handlers who worked on the Lockerbie crash and helped find the bodies. So as a dog handler, I'm preparing my people for every type of disaster. It's essential. And I know that there's going to be another speaker who will talk more about what we're looking for in the future. But I urge you, all of you, start pushing your own communities to get better preparedness. It's really important. Don't get caught in what I call the ostrich shovel, which means that the disaster preparedness manual was written after World War II. It's about this thick, and it's collected dust, and it's never been revised. A good disaster manual is about this thick and really consists of a good resource list and a good management plan, and should be the sort of thing you can leaf through in a few minutes, essential phone numbers, and you can move things. But don't let your own community get caught in the "it'll never happen to us" type of syndrome, because that's very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you very much. John Hammack is the executive director of Oxfam America, and he's going to be batting cleanup for us now. John.
Thank you. Last fall, if you'll remember, we started in September with the floods in Bangladesh, and then we moved to some hurricanes in the Caribbean, which led to the hurricane which wiped out bluefields in Nicaragua. Throughout the fall, we had the growing disaster of Sudan, which ended up killing 250,000 people in last year because of war. And then we crowned that off with the disaster in Armenia. Disasters are going to continue to happen. If we look at what the experts are saying in terms of the greenhouse effect, in terms of the climate getting warmer, etc., we are probably in for the next 10 to 15 years a growing list of litany of disasters throughout the world. Our first impulse when we have a disaster is we got to do something. And the first thing we want to do is we want to go ourselves. What can I do to help? We get phone calls at Oxfam all the time. What can I do? Can't I go? The second thing you want to take the shirt off your back and send it, because you know that people need shirts, clothes, food, medicine. And it's very important for people to realize that that's really not sometimes very helpful. That oftentimes the first response of trying to do something, as was mentioned earlier, really has to be coordinated in a very direct way, or it can be tremendously costly to send things to a disaster. You can send the wrong things. Also, in a disaster, you have to think of who is going to actually receive the things, the goods. Who are you going to work through? It's a political question. Are you going to, in Sudan or Bangladesh or Nicaragua or in the Soviet Union, work through local groups that are the government? Or are you going to work through nonprofit agencies? For example, in Bangladesh, Oxfam worked through nonprofit organizations throughout the country during the floods, and I was there sitting on top of a roof with a lot of people, with the water was all around. And we decided to work through private organizations, not the government. But the government, about 3 or 4 months later, got really upset because all these resources were going now through nonprofit agencies, and there became a political tug-of-war between government and the nonprofit sector. And the question then becomes is who are you helping, not just in a human sense, but politically, who are you helping in your disaster response? The other thing about disaster response one has to be very careful of is the creation of long-term dependency. I'm speaking now of what your response is after the initial situation which was described. Because when you have that initial situation, yes, one has to find the bodies, yes, one has to find the living people who are under the rubble. But the question is, and you have to send food and you have to send medicine, but the question is, from the very beginning, what is your goal? Is your goal just emergency, or is your goal also long-term development? And is your goal recovery? And how do you, from the very beginning, start thinking about ways in which you can try to do something and ways in which to work which help the long-term development of the area, not just the short-term survival of people. I'd like to just mention two things in the United States, because when you have a disaster response, you have the response here in the States, then you have what's happening in the country. And I'd like to talk about two or three things very quickly. First is the media. The power of the media is unbelievable. In Oxfam America, we didn't do any fundraising around Armenia. We didn't send out any appeals around Armenia. All we did is list our name in the newspaper along with a lot of other groups, and we received $140,000 doing nothing, just by putting a name in the newspaper in the listing. I would say that Armenia, the response to Armenia was really, and the response to many disasters, and this may sound cynical, but I've been doing it for so long that it's no longer, I think, cynical. I think it's real. A lot of the response of the media depends on timing. The media responds much better to disasters if they happen to take place around Thanksgiving or Christmas or in the period between. It tends to be a time of emotion, a time when you can get much more response from the American public, and a time when the media is focusing on that type of human issue. Also, to get the media involved, it's got to be a simple story. Sudan has never become a media disaster because it's too complicated. People are shooting each other. It's a very complex story. It's a story of famine, but of war, and there are no good guys. There's no white hat at all in Sudan. They're all bad guys. And however, in Ethiopia, the story was simplified. Starving people, sent food, everything will be fine. In Armenia, the story, again, was fairly simple. People are dying, let's help, and things will be fine. And I think the media needs a simple story. And unfortunately, many of the disasters that we're seeing that are man-made are not very simple. They're political. Also, I think the media has to have something that's quick. We can send something in, we can do and we can leave. And yet, of course, disasters are not short-term. Armenia is still a disaster and will be a disaster for a long time as it recovers. But the media has left it because it already did its thing. We went in, we did our thing, we survived, we helped, and now we're out. And yet the real recovery takes place after the media has left, and that's when the dollars dry up, both in terms of government and in terms of the private sector. The role of Americans is very important. The media wants to see Americans going over there and Americans doing and Americans saving lives and Americans doing the work. Whereas, in fact, if it's going to be long-term, the work has got to be done by Armenians, by Sudanese, by Bangladeshis, by Nicaraguans. And we, therefore, the media has this built-in image that we have to be the saviors and therefore show that we're doing it right. And then, of course, the situation has to be really desperate because if not, the media overlooks it. They have to now, in Africa, you have to have a disaster that's worse than Ethiopia because if not, it doesn't compare to Ethiopia and therefore it won't get on the news. So that you look at the media, and I'm simplifying and going very quickly, but there's a lot of these efforts, I think, which have to do with what gets covered and what doesn't get covered. And I think another area that one has to focus on is the role of the U.S. government. If the U.S. government responds and wants to respond, it can have a tremendous impact, as you just heard. If the U.S. government says, no, that disaster, we're going to turn the other, we don't recognize the disaster like they did in Nicaragua hurricane, then the dollars dry up immediately. And there's very little response over the long term. Now, it seems to me that if we are going to have long-term development, long-term recovery, we have to ask the question of who are the people who are most vulnerable in the disaster situation before the disaster happened and certainly after the disaster happened. Usually it's people who are poor or who are living on the margin, even in Armenia. These are the people who are going to have the hardest time making it back, not just to status quo, but to full recovery and hopefully a better life than before. Certainly in Bangladesh, the people who are most vulnerable were the people who, for example, sitting on the top of their roof with the floods all around, a loan shark would come over and say, listen, you guys don't have anything to eat. I'd be more than glad to buy your piece of land from you. And they do. In a disaster, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. In Ethiopia, the women sold their jewelries in order to get food to eat. They sold their cattle, and then they had to buy it back a year later at inflated prices. And I think these are the kinds of things, as you're looking for disaster response, that one has to get into. How do you try to overcome the vulnerability of people over the long term to get them to preserve their assets and to build their base so that they're not in the same vulnerable situation that they were in before? In terms of housing, it means the kinds of things we just talked about, of trying to have housing which will not collapse, trying to build less vulnerable housing. In terms of Bangladesh, for example, and lowlands, is trying to prepare yourself ahead of time so that people know where to go when the floods are coming, which are areas that are higher up. In terms of community organization, a lot of work needs to be done in terms of organizing people so that they know not just what to do in terms of a disaster, but what to do in terms of their long-term development. And I don't think it's enough to prepare people for a disaster. It's important to prepare people for their own long-term development work. So in ending, I would say that as we look at the whole area of disaster and lessons learned from Armenia, and lessons learned really not just from Armenia, but from a number of disasters, we not only have to prepare ourselves for disaster, but we have to have the right mentality of how to approach the disasters. We don't want to create further dependencies on the West. We don't want to create further dependencies on the United States. We want to create, from the very beginning of our response to a disaster, those systems and those local, and build those local coping mechanisms which already are there. We need to work through those local coping mechanisms, build them up, and help people have more capacity to resist disasters over the long term. I would end by saying that, unfortunately, I did not go to Armenia. And I've used other examples from my own personal experience. The disaster in Armenia was, I think, in terms of the vividness of it, tremendously appalling to all of us. I'm very concerned of the Armenias to come, not just in the Third World, but also in the North. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what we'll do now is I'm going to ask the panel a question, but that is merely to give you all time to think up your questions. And if you do have any, please at this point walk toward one of the two microphones, and I will give you an opportunity to ask your question. What I would like to ask focuses on a point that a number of you have discussed, and that is the role of the United States government, either as a catalyst, as John put it, for encouraging others to give money, or as a way of organizing, as Carolyn was talking about, organizing an international effort in which the United States could play a leading role. What single important recommendation would each of you like to make at this point toward the U.S. government, looking toward the future? Claude, you want to start?
Well, I should have relied on you to ask a tough question like that. And you know, in the abstract, I don't think that there really is an answer. I think that this government takes its message from the people that it serves, and I think we are on the leading edge of what I would consider a new perspective, a new global perspective. I think it probably commenced before the war in Vietnam, when we were able to term ourselves, however uncomfortably, an ugly American. It marched right through the war, and I think we're emerging on the other side as a nation that tends to care more and perceives the world in a more humanitarian way, a little less militarily. Our spheres of influence are I think, are having to confront new realities, and I think those realities tend to focus more on what you can do for people and to them. This is a small cog in a very large wheel, but I think it's a shining one. We have a tremendous amount to do in order to achieve our end as a humanitarian function, and I see all around our own country any number of grassroots, independent, private enterprise groups springing up that are reaching for the same stars to reach across oceans and help people on the other side. And I think what we see ahead of us as a nation that can apply our resources across oceans is to start achieving a better sense of what our resources are and integrate them. I look forward to seeing the United States government take the lead in that respect.
Thank you very much. Bill?
Okay. This comes as a very practical problem for my office, which deals with Africa and Europe. And I guess the thing that sort of strikes me in the disaster field is that disasters are going to increase. Most of my work takes place in Africa, for example, in Sudan. We spent just under $2 million in Armenia on the earthquake. This is official OFDA funding. In Sudan, since
OFDA is the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance.
Right.
Okay.
Which is the outfit for the U.S. government that responds to international disasters. While we spent $2 million in Armenia, in Sudan over the past 6 months we've spent, including food, about $75 million. It's a massive problem there. We have a similar situation in Mozambique, in Somalia, a smaller one in Ethiopia. What we're seeing is disasters increase, but we don't have the resources. The U.S. plays a significant role in most of these events, but we simply don't have the funds to cover the problems, to take care of the problems. The secret for us is preparedness and getting the countries themselves to prepare for their own disasters and to spend more of our resources on preparedness rather than the U.S. responding directly. We simply are going to run out of resources. And I think over the near term we have to do whatever we can with local governments to help them prepare to take care of their own disasters rather than relying on the international community in the U.S.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, very simply, I would like to see the U.S. Government have an overarching principle in their foreign policy which would not use food as a political weapon and which would always respond in some way to a humanitarian crisis, not in a political way, but in a humanitarian way. I don't think we have that in our foreign policy right now. We have, over the last years, politicized humanitarian aid, I think, often, and used humanitarian aid for political purposes. I think that has to stop, and most of what we do overseas is fine, but if you look at some examples of U.S. government response to humanitarian crises, they've been very politicized. And even the use of the word humanitarian aid to give money to the Contras, I think, is a bit strange. And I would hope that we would have an overarching principle in our foreign policy never to use food as a political weapon.
Now, you had mentioned a moment ago, John, the conflict sometimes, or at least the tension between private organizations, private agencies trying to help, and government resistance, perhaps for even natural reasons, toward allowing private organizations to get into the act or to get too much into the act. That's a tough problem, I imagine, in the midst of a disaster. How do you handle it?
Let me say that that's a very recent phenomenon, but one that I see coming, because more and more of your donors, U.S. government, World Bank, UN, are beginning to put money through nonprofit agencies. And as such, all of a sudden governments are saying, hey, wait a minute, that money used to flow through us. And there's beginning, I think, to be set up a real tension. We're to the point where in Sudan some of the nonprofits have been thrown out of the country. And I think that how you deal with it is you have to be tremendously sensitive, highly politically skilled, to walk the line between doing your work and making sure that you cover your political self also in those countries. And it becomes very, it isn't a question of just provide. That's why I mentioned who are you trying to help in those countries becomes very important, and who are you working through.
Carolyn?
Okay, I think a lot of the people who preceded me have taken some of my thoughts already. I would like to repeat, though, the fact that we do need to make a concerted effort to help people who live in disaster-prone areas to be prepared, to have teams, to have self-sufficiency. They are going to be the first ones on the scene. I would like to see more coordination internationally among the international search and rescue community. We have come a long way already. I think it can increase and get better. I would also like to see FEMA get more involved in Federal Emergency Management Agency, which really is the national equivalent of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which deals with the international problems. I would like to see them get more involved in training and preparedness for our own country.
Okay, we'll now go to the audience for questions, and if you have them, just go to either one of the two microphones. Gentleman right there, please.
Thank you for your last comments. In 1983, I was one of 12 people who wrote a civilian disaster medical response under a grant from FEMA. I've taught that course all around North America, including twice in Canada, sponsored by the Canadian Office of Emergency Preparedness. Seems like many people don't even know it exists. It was designed to be useful and easily accessible, quickly referenced, as you mentioned, Carol Ann. That's my first question. Were you aware that such a plan existed, at least for civilian response in this country to disasters where there are casualties? The other question I had is, or question I'd like to pose to the panelists is, very early on after the disaster, having some language skills and a lot of knowledge about earthquake medical response, I made an effort through telephone numbers, the State Department, whatever, to volunteer my services. And I got put on many, many lists and got nowhere. If it hadn't been for the help of my friend Carol Ann Nigerian, probably would never have gotten to Armenia to help out. It was very frustrating because I had a unique combination of skills and background that would have been useful in this. As I've said to others, it was as though I had prepared over 40 years for that, to help in that event, and yet I was completely frustrated for 3 weeks. I think that points out the need for much better coordination. And I'll take one, if you will, Mr. Cal, one dissenting position, that perhaps not all the coordination and resources should come from the government. We had on the airplane that we went over with $5 million of antibiotics donated from just one company. I have been contacted by that company and many others that are willing to donate equal and perhaps even more supplies as needed for future disasters, given a coordinated mechanism with which to work. And we're all hoping that as a result of our experience there, the misfortune of the Armenian people, we can coordinate international disaster response. There are meetings being scheduled around the world to analyze this disaster and others.
Okay. Thank you very much. Who would like to? Bill, go ahead.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, it's unfortunate that your skills were missed in the Armenian situation. When a disaster hits, it's very tough to catalog all the people and the resources that are made available. We in OFDA try to do that. When a disaster hits and we set up a 24-hour operation, we work with one voluntary organization called VITA, which puts people in our offices, and when people call with either skills or commodities or anything else, they're recorded, and those lists are circulated daily to get in contact with the people or utilize the resources as we plan our disaster response. I can't really explain exactly why you were missed. It's unfortunate, but we try not to let that happen during the course of a disaster. I don't know if you wanted to respond to the medicines. I can.
Yeah. Actually, there's some very valuable points to come up here. First, when I began to work with the government in OFDA, a number of things came as a shock to me. Probably the single most important is that they did not have the money to do the job that they were mandated to do. And Bill's, he's not in a position to say this, but this is one of the hardest working bunch of people I've seen in the U.S. government, and I've worked with as a consultant in other parts of the government. They don't have a resource base. They didn't have a medical component until Armenia, and component would not have been incorporated at all. There is a high sensitivity in the relief community, international relief community, that the medical component, again specifically in medicine, it's a sensitive topic. In virtually any prior disaster, there had always been discussion of superfluous, these individuals coming down from the United States, when in fact we really have more than adequate medical care domestically to handle this internal problem. That the medical team was asked to go at all did, from a diplomatic point of view, require a little fortitude.
Just can I add a
Briefly,
comment
go
to
ahead,
that?
sure.
The medical component of any disaster, as Claude says, is a very difficult one. When we respond, in the case of Armenia or any other, we respond to a list of medicines pre-approved by the government. If lists are not, if medicines are not on that list, we don't send it on our airplane. And so that sort of limits what we can provide. We sent a second, I was just going to mention a minute, we sent a second disaster team to Armenia that people don't hear much about. That entailed shelter specialists and medical doctors, telecommunications people, and pharmacists. We sent 5 or 6 pharmacists who spoke Armenian and Russian, and they literally went through all the warehouses to identify the medicine stock there, translate the titles into either Armenian and Russian, and train local the doctors or medical personnel on how to use medicines they were not familiar with. And that gets into some of the problems when medicines arrive that aren't on the approved list. It gets more dramatic if you look at a country like Malawi, for one, where a plane load of medical supplies was sent there, and they needed aspirin. What they got was Advil, and the local folks didn't have a clue what that was because it didn't feel the same, it didn't look the same, and they couldn't use it. So medicines are very tricky things to deal with, and so it's a difficult problem for us.
Very interesting. Question here, please.
I'm curious as to lessons that you learned, because most of you didn't really address those. If there were another earthquake tomorrow in Soviet Armenia, what would you do differently that you didn't do or that you did in December?
Carolyn, why don't you start with that?
Okay, for one thing, I would probably have taken more dogs so that we could have had a better work-rest schedule, gone in rotating shifts. I feel that, for instance, especially the firefighters from Miami had not been attuned to winter weather or survival. I would hope that after this they have learned something on that. Definitely take communications. That is our lifeline, those communications. Have probably had more interpreters. We had certainly excellent people from the University of Yerevan, but they were limited as to they couldn't be 5 places at once. And there were times when I would lead my small team, 4 of the dogs, because we split up, onto a disaster site and no interpreter. And I'd just very loudly say, parlez-vous français? Sprechen Sie Deutsch? English? And I was lucky. Invariably somebody spoke either French or German, and when all else failed, hand signals. Winterized tents would have been nice under those circumstances. It was cold, but we all have to learn winter survival. And I know I'm going to get a chuckle of this. If Bob Kiesecker were here, he'd kick me. After the first earthquake and after the second earthquake, every time we had a lessons learned little workshop, I said, please provide us with rudimentary sanitary facilities. They are very important, and I want to see them on that next plane load.
Claude, would you like to add something?
As Caroline alluded to, there have been a number of shakeout sessions since Armenia where we've said just what did we do wrong that we don't have to repeat, because there were moments there where you just, it's almost like going to war as a young man and saying, won't this be glorious? You've got all these great plans of things that you would like to do and see happen, fantasies, and then there's the reality. And you don't know that reality until you're there, where in a late night when you take out a tin cup and you pour it full of water, by the time it gets to your lips, there's a thin sheet of ice on it. When you end up with 4 hours of sleep each night because Soviet jets are flying overhead to drop off cranes and carry off the wounded, you wonder, well, did you really position yourself in the right place? The lessons in some were they were hard won by this team that was there that first week. In the large scope of things, it's just one thing that needs to be addressed. But to that end, there's been a considerable amount of work done within this team, the technicians, as someone referred to us before, to get our act in shape before the next one. It's not if there's going to be a next one, it's just going to be a question of when and where and how prepared we are. I can't tell you how obvious it really is when you get off that plane and you're standing in Lenenikon and you know that a political decision made days before, or an allocation or failure of allocation to be resource to be allocated, translates into human lives and deaths. It's remarkable. So these are not specifics that I'm giving you, because most of it's just internal housekeeping, but a number of things have come out of here in a very productive fashion. There are now people from various military services who are going to be reinforcing certain parts of our training. There is a completely revamped financial structure for how these things are going to be paid for, et cetera.
Next question, please.
Mr. Garvelink mentioned the French and the Swiss sending people over, and I was curious what the coordination of international efforts was, if that's possible.
Once over there, do you mean? Yeah. Well, let me comment on one thing. I think maybe Carolyn will take it from a different perspective. When we went over to Armenia, our group was split. Most of the folks stayed out by the airport, but there were 4 or 5 of us who stayed in the government buildings in Lenenikon itself. And I was there with about 3 or 4 or 5 other people. We stayed across the hall from the Swiss. And it was sort of a central point where a lot of the search and rescue teams would come in. They would always go into that central area because it was the government headquarters, at least to make contact. And on the ground there for several days running, every evening at about 8 o'clock at night, 10, 11, 12 search and rescue teams from different countries would show up there. We got our hands on an old map, and we put that up on the wall. And every night we would mark off where we had been. They would mark off where they had been. And in a general sense, we'd agree where people would go the next day. And so it was a very informal system that I think began with the Swiss. And then about the time, or the day after we arrived, the Swiss left. And then everybody started, we had one room on the second floor, and everybody started coming to our room. And so I don't know quite why it happened, but we ended up coordinating the activities to the extent that was coordination on a sort of an evening basis, every evening.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of comments. I know when I initially spoke, I did say that was the first time I saw real international coordination. We had some incidents in El Salvador where, quite frankly, there were too many nations trying to be worker ants on one pile, and things got a little bit heated. Since then, Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance had the foresight to send 2 of us to Europe last September, and we met with and spent time with various European groups. When we walked into Lenanikon, I knew some of the Germans, I knew some of the Swiss already on a first-name basis. I mean, we had sat together and chugged a few beers and compared war stories back in September. And so it was very natural that we started to coordinate. I also saw an enormous amount of coordination among groups from Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria. We worked with a lot of different people. Also, over the past week, again, thanks to the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, we have had many foreign nationals, both in Washington, D.C., and later at a conference in New Orleans. And this exchange, this coordination, has gone even further, to the point where we have been invited to go and spend time in the Swedish training school, the Israeli training school, and the Austrian training school. It's a very exciting time internationally. The world is getting smaller.
Yes, please.
Two general questions. Just how prepared were the Soviets themselves? I'm not sure if we discussed that. And secondly, the issue of long-term development, whether or not you know of any kind of changes that are being made now that would, as Mr. Hammack was talking about, the importance of the long-term development, if anything's changing now since the disaster.
Bill, do you want to take that first question about how quickly the Russians moved? One of you said that it was 53 hours after the disaster before the first Russian team arrived?
Before the first search and rescue team arrived.
Search and rescue team arrived.
The French and the Swiss arrived 53 hours after the earthquake. Prior to that, it was all the responsibility of the local officials. It's hard to say exactly what the preparations were in Armenia. I guess I was slightly surprised at the level of confusion in Leningrad when we arrived there. There was no traffic control, but there was some organization to do searching through the rubble. I guess what sticks out in my mind is the first person I met there was the mayor of Leningrad, who had lost 15 members of his family. Most people were in shock, and it was a very difficult time when we arrived. I think under the circumstances, they were doing a pretty good job.
But wouldn't it be absolutely natural in any kind of disaster of this sort for there to be total confusion? And I know that Carolyn spoke very highly of the disaster manual that was put out by the Federal Emergency Disaster Agency, whatever it's called. And I remember doing a story on that several years ago where they had put out a booklet on how to handle yourself on Long Island immediately after a Soviet nuclear attack. And they said that the highways may become busy and that you're supposed to leave and go across a bridge in a certain way and to listen to the radio to make sure you know what roads to take. Well, it all sounded so utterly absurd that that's a nuclear war, and of course it's something, fortunately, that has not happened and we hope will never happen. But natural disasters we know will happen, so that the confusion is natural. And I think what the question might have been getting at is structurally, systemically, how well do you feel the Russians are prepared to handle this? Or for that matter, how well are the Americans prepared to handle it? Not that well.
No, I worked Bridgeport, Connecticut, one building collapse. And I always take that as a prime example of how totally chaotic and disorganized one single collapse can be. They had people flying in from all over the United States who wanted to test instruments. Volunteers coming in that were either skilled or non-skilled. A prime example is we had a gentleman running around on the rubble, and he had a hard hat on, and written on the hard hat it said "Sight Shrink." He had actually recently left a loony bin, and he was out there trying to counsel people. We had also a person who was not a doctor who was running around writing prescriptions with a prescription pad that he had stolen. There was zero control of resources, and that's one site in our country. So when people say that we have chaos abroad, I giggle, believe me.
John, did you want to add something to that?
Well, just on the long-term development question,
Please.
maybe I would say, for example, we received very little amount of money, Oxfam, $140,000 for Armenia. We made a conscious decision not to spend the money immediately. In Ethiopia, we made the same decision. We did some immediate response with some of the money that we received, but we also knew that the dollars that were going to go into Armenia, just like in Ethiopia, would start to dry up after the initial media blitz. So we made a decision to take a longer-term approach and to start spending the money over a period of time because we knew that the dollars would dry up. And therefore, what we're doing now is funding, for example, in the area of shelter, we're looking at trying to fund, and we are funding, a housing program which builds housing which will be resistant to this type of earthquake, we hope, or we think, or the experts believe. And that's one response which is taking place, for example, on a longer-term basis.
Yes.
Add one thing. There are a number of things underway as a result of the Armenian earthquake. NASA is setting up TV links with medical facilities in Armenia so that experts can consult as they work. Through HUD, they're developing better construction techniques for shelters in disaster-prone areas. CDC is very active in Armenia right now with developing more medical response structures. And the U.S. Geological Survey is working with Soviet experts on seismic studies and that sort of thing. So there are a number of scientific arrangements that are presently underway.
Good. Thank you. Question, please.
Mr. Garvelink and Mr. Hammack, do you think the U.S. should or should support the institutionalization of increased cooperation, international cooperation, dealing with disaster emergencies, and should or could that come under the UN agencies?
There's certainly a role for the United Nations. I tend to feel that the United Nations is an excellent vehicle for disaster response. However, there are times and places where it's really important to have a variety of responses. I think that the U.S. government, through the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, in terms of the response to an immediate disaster, has had the flexibility and the resources of the American structure behind it in order to move very quickly. The United Nations sometimes is not so quick, I think. I would be hard-pressed, I think, in terms of arguing to abolish the U.S. government response and put it through the UN, I think, myself. I also believe, because there are different philosophies, like I was trying to allude to briefly, on what to do over the long term, that it's important not just to have the U.S. government response, but also private response from the American people, because there are some countries in which the U.S. government doesn't work. For example, we happen to work also in Cambodia at this point, and it's a people-to-people effort to try to work in that country, which I think is crucial at a time when our U.S. government, for political reasons, doesn't have programs in that country.
Mm-hmm. Bill, do you want to?
Well, yeah, I think we've got to sort of use all the resources that are available to us, and one is to work through the UN system, largely for international conferences and the dissemination of information. The UN, really in the disaster area, is not an operational organization. UNDRO, which is their main organization, the UN Disaster Relief Organization, is an information sharing organization. And in fact, in Armenia, it arrived a little bit late. It had its own difficulties getting in there. But I think for most of our activities, we work through private voluntary organizations. We do not provide assistance to government. We usually work through U.S. voluntary agencies or international organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross or European NGOs. But I think we've got to use all the resources that are available.
We have time for two more questions. We'll go here and then here. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is for Claude and Caroline. I just wanted to ask how emotionally you deal with such tragedies, and if there was any particular incident in Soviet Armenia that helped you deal with your emotions while you were there.
Claude.
Yeah, it's a very central theme in disaster medicine. In fact, Caroline and I were both just down in New Orleans teaching a few courses, and the questions following my discussion of medical considerations of disaster were remarkably focused on what did this do to the team, what did this do to them as individuals and in the aggregate emotionally. The sort of work that Caroline and I do professionally is intended to teach you to dissociate between the emotional impact and what it is that you need to do. And hopefully when the dust clears and you're gone, you process. There were moments there that were just, I think, for all of us as individuals, overwhelming. There was, for me specifically, I remember climbing up a little mountain that used to be an 11-story building, and as I was just reaching up to the top, there was a doll and a pair of pajama bottoms that large, and it cuts right through, and you really just have to stop. You're utterly useless until you can sort that sort of thing out. There were individuals, and a surprising number of them, who had not only lost their entire families but were also themselves physically injured, who approached me, and as one individual said to me, I have a pain right here, and the translator and I and the patient went through this as one of the walking wounded, and it turned out that what the man was saying was that he did not have a rib fracture, as so many did, but he had a pain deep in his heart, and he wanted to know what the great doctors from the United States had for a broken heart. There were episodes like that, fellow with pneumonia. Stop smoking. You're going to tell me to stop smoking? My entire family is dead. How do I stop smoking? And there were moments like that. Yeah.
Last question.
Carolyn, how was your work funded?
Okay, we are a volunteer component. We do not get paid for doing this. We do get our per diem and our logistical support from OFDA, but we are not paid to do this, whether it's nationally or internationally.
In other words, you need financially independent people to do this.
Right. I am now trying to get some grants and things so we can help some of our handlers to afford to go to training sites that may not be an hour from their back door.
Mm-hmm. I hope that's being addressed in all your planning, because from what I understand, you were very, very valuable.
Thank you.
We are just about out of time. Sarah, did you want to say something?
We have some pamphlets and some informational packets on the table regarding disasters, and I hope everyone here will take it.
I hope everybody heard that. There is some information. We're just about out of time. I'd like to just say before we wrap up that there is a colleague of mine here from NBC, Janet Janjikian, who I know I didn't prepare you for this, but I know you're terribly shy, but she did something quite remarkable, and a producer from NBC in the Washington Bureau, and for 2 minutes, which is more than you ever gave to me, would you like to come up here and just tell us what you did, and then we can wrap up the evening?
Marvin's right. I took away more time from him than I ever gave him. Sorry about that. But you're picking it up now. My name is Janet Janjigian, and I am a second-generation American Armenian, born and raised in California. I didn't have an opportunity to go to Armenia during the earthquake, that is, to cover it as a story. So in February, I obtained a visa as a relief worker with a cultural organization that sponsored me from Yerevan. I took a week's vacation. I took home video camera, and I went to Spitak and Leninikon, and I did my own shooting for the first time in my life. That is my own camera work. And I put together a series that was 3 parts, and I sold it to our owned and operated stations, which is our largest stations around the country, and also our affiliate service. So the series ran in just about all 200 of our affiliates around the country. I have just recently sold it to the Today Show, and sometime in the beginning of June, I'll go on, and the series will go on.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
That's great. I just I didn't know all of the details of that, but I thought that it would be interesting to point out that every now and then the press does work beyond the ways in which John described it earlier. I think this is the kind of evening that we should have here much more often. I think that we have all learned a great deal about one tragedy and look toward ways of coordinating better in anticipation of others. I want to thank the panel very much and thank all of you for joining us.